Hi, good morning. I'm just giving everybody a second to connect here. It is 10 a.m. on Monday, and that means it is time for Political Science 101. How is everybody doing? I also have to go ahead and get my chat going down here. There we go. Live now. All right. I also have to go ahead and get my chat going. I'm going to give everybody a second to get online because I noticed there's nobody actually online yet. Oh, there's somebody. Just giving everybody a second to, basically come in the doors. And then we're going to pick up with our discussion of elections and campaigns in America, especially about money in morning. Good morning. Money in our campaigns. We're going to talk about campaign finance a lot today. Hi there. I'm going to give it about another 30 seconds and we'll get started. People can trickle in as they trickle in. Alrighty, okay, let's see. Yeah, let's get started. We left off talking about American elections and specifically about campaign finance laws. We talked about the Citizens United versus FEC ruling that allowed for billionaires and major corporations to essentially contribute as much as they want, not to candidates, but to the campaign for candidates' re-elections. So let's first talk about PACs. PACs originally were not as sinister a thing as they are now. A PAC was originally intended to be a group of at least 50 people affiliated with some sort of interest group that is permitted to make contributions to candidates for federal office. The idea being that if you are, especially like a 501c3, like a Planned Parenthood or a Sierra Club or something like that. Oftentimes these organizations, because they're 501c3, they're not allowed to actually advocate for any sort of candidate or policy in public life. Actually, they're allowed to advocate for issues, but they're not allowed to advocate for candidates. So if you are, say, National Nurses United, and you're really behind Bernie Sanders and his reform of American healthcare, which they are, it's a thing, then maybe you form, National Nurses Political Action Committee, and you give a bunch of money to that, all y'all give your $25 to that Political Action Committee. That committee bundles it all together and gives one big check from, the nurses union to Bernie Sanders, right? It says, hey, look, this, now you know where your money's coming from. Now you have somebody that can, ask for favors a little bit later on. So that's what a PAC is. And obviously there was some abuses in the PAC system already. But then came Citizens United versus FEC. And with Citizens United, we saw the development of the Super PAC, which are organizations that are allowed to raise and spend an unlimited amount of money to promote a candidate or publicize a cause. They can advocate anything they want. They can advocate whoever's election they want. However, they may not directly coordinate or directly contribute to a political campaign. And that's how we got the video that you saw in the last lecture, that Mitch McConnell working for Kentuckians video with the jangly guitar music. Incidentally, I got a copyright strike over that. So fun. Um, but I'm appealing it. It's fair use. It's educational. It's political commentary, so they can suck eggs. But whatever. Point is that we now have a situation where with these super PACs, billionaires, large corporations are all able to contribute just unfathomably massive amounts of money to our politics. And they're able to do so legally and, importantly, anonymously. Super PACs do not have to disclose their donors, so they don't have to tell you who is giving that money. So that gets us to this situation where our elections are costing more and more and more and more every single year, to the point that in 2018 the midterms cost not almost twice, but a significant amount, half again more than the presidential elections in 2000. The 2014 midterms and the 2010 midterms also outclassed the 2000 presidential election in terms of spending. An enormous amount of money is flowing into our politics, and the amount increases every single time we have one of these election cycles. Now that I have everybody listening really quickly, so there's a whole bunch of money in our politics and also quizzes. I was looking at my syllabus, and it turns out I forgot the last week of March on my syllabus, which thank God, because I thought I had, I thought I was like a week behind. Fortunately, we're not a week behind, but I made the quiz available. It's going to be available starting after lecture on next week. After Thursday lecture next week. That Friday, the quiz will become available. You can take it on that Friday or at any point during spring break. It'll be due the Sunday night before we get back to campus. You can take it on Canvas. Now, y'all are on the honor system on this because I can't enforce this, but these are intended to be closed book, closed note, closed Google exams. Said I can't really stop you, but I hope that if you do it, you at least feel really bad about it, okay? Please, 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 please be honest and take these exams seriously. They'll be available for the week of spring break, starting the Friday before, ending the Sunday after. So you'll have like 10 days to take those. Finally, the final exam is going to be available starting Wednesday of the finals week and going through the following Sunday. 11:59 p.m. Sunday after finals week will be the close of the exam, and also the deadline for any late work, any adjustments, anything like that. I should have your course grades in the system by Wednesday. So that is all also summarized on an announcement on Canvas, so if you want to go check under the announcement tab and get the due dates for the second exam. Third exam, as I said, is going to be Wednesday through Sunday of finals week. It will be available. Paper is still due same time, should be submitted to the same place that it would have been submitted. I have opened up those boxes, so some people actually, amazingly enough, are turning in their papers already. You guys are way more productive in this whole quarantine than I am. Let me just say that. Personally, I've just been playing Animal Crossing. So much Animal Crossing. And that's only been out since Friday, so I mean, before that I was just kind of going nuts. But yeah, so if you're already turning in your papers, you can do that. You're welcome to do that. The box is open. It just opened this morning, so if you weren't able to do it before, that's why. And we have nothing to do. Yeah, I mean, I guess you guys can be hella productive. I'm just binge watching. That's all I'm doing. See, it's been a week and I think I've left my house, or at least left my property twice, both to go to the grocery store. I am getting a little stir crazy, but anyway, on that topic, elections. We actually might see a drop in election spending, at least in terms of campaign spending this year, just because campaigns aren't flitting about all over the country anymore. So the question is, does this all result in a democratic system where, as many critics will say, basically our system is bought? Right? We have a democracy for the rich and an autocracy for the poor. And there's actually good, solid, crunchy political science evidence on that subject. One of my favorite books in political science is a book by a Princeton professor, say that 5 times fast, by the name of Larry Bartels. In this book, Unequal Democracy, he basically shows, using pretty convincing survey and quantitative data, that neither party listens to the poor, and that, in fact, the Republicans will sometimes go out of their way to vote against the poor. The Democrats listen to the middle class at least a little, and both parties listen to the wealthy. This is because, while some groups mainly contribute to one party or another, most businesses actually split their donations between the two major parties. You donate to the incumbent and the challenger, so that when they get in office, both of them owe you something, right? Of course, betting on a politician who's already won an election is always a pretty safe bet. Incumbents generally overwhelm their challengers, both in terms of vote totals and just in sheer fundraising numbers. Sitting senators amassed an average of about $10 million in the 2018 election, whereas their opponents raised less than $750,000 on average. So that makes sense. Businesses want to curry favor with people who are going to get power. And re-election rates in 2016 were 96% for the House, 93% for the Senate. Overwhelmingly, as we're going to talk about in more detail later on in the lecture, overwhelmingly, we send our members of Congress back to Congress. And accordingly, this need to raise money makes office holders sensitive to their funders, right? I mentioned in the last lecture that many office holders are frustrated that they have to spend so much time sitting at a desk in a call center in a Democratic Party headquarters building, calling and asking rich people for money. Hi, this is Congresswoman Martin, and I just wanted to... I noticed that you were a big supporter of mine last time around, so I'm just hoping you could do that again. Remember that at least our members of the House, they run for re-election every 2 years, right? So, the election is in November, you get sworn in January, and then it's only, could be as little as a year to your primary election, right? Could be as little as 1 year until you have to stand for re-election again. And most of the time incumbents do win their primaries, but that's not the point. The point is that members of Congress have to spend a lot of time asking rich people for money. And that makes them sensitive to the needs of the people who are giving them that money. You have to imagine that if a member of Congress were to call you up and say, hey, can you send me a check? You can say, sure, but what are you going to do about insert pet issue, right? Are you going to bring down the taxes on my yacht, right? Stuff like that. So this dynamic means that members of Congress and politicians in general are uniquely sensitive to the needs of the wealthy. Now, campaign money doesn't seem to matter as much in high-profile races, especially in terms of the presidency, hotly contested Senate races, things like that. But down ballot, for the House, for state Senate, for state assembly, for local offices. We went through just how many of those positions exist in our last lecture, right? I went through a long, exhaustingly long list of who we vote for here in Clark County. And on those down ballot races, money counts. A lot of times those races are won simply out of name recognition, right? Sometimes people will just vote for the person that they've heard of over the person that they haven't. And what gets name recognition? Advertising, right? If you're on the TV machine saying, "Hi, I'm Allie Martin and I'm running for Congress," people look at the ballot and they go, "Oh, well, I've heard of her." And if your opponent is getting outspent, they can't buy as much in the way of advertising. They can't buy as many of those yard signs. They can't pay as many people to go tape them to illegally tape them to telephone poles on the day before the election. Seriously, I know people who used to do this to make a little bit of extra money. They would specifically go to campaigns and say, "We will tape up your signs to every telephone pole in town, but we're going to do it the weekend before the election because code enforcement won't come out except Monday through Friday." And it's illegal to tape political signs to city property, to city light poles and things like that. But code enforcement wouldn't come out till Monday. The election was on Tuesday. And so I know these people who would go out and illegally tape campaign signs to light poles or post them in street medians. But they charge money for that, right? And so if you have money, you can post your sign on every city-owned light pole that you can find the weekend before the election when they won't have time to take it down. And if you don't have money, you can't do that, right? If you don't have money, you can't do that. And so if you're in this down ballot race where simply getting your name out there could be enough to win, money really does seem to matter. See, I already talked about super PACs. Let's talk about the other major way in which the Supreme Court has recently gutted our campaign finance laws. So we're going to talk about, there we go. Not going to get into bundling yet. We're going to talk about contributing directly to campaigns. Now, if you want to contribute to a super PAC or just straight up buy advertising yourself, you're allowed to do that in as much profusion as you wish. It is free speech in America now. That is Citizens United versus FEC. But at the same time, the limits that we do have, which tend to apply only to direct contributions to candidates, those limits have also been significantly weakened in recent years. Used to be, so you can see on this graphic that in 2010, you could donate $5,200 per campaign to House and Senate candidates. But you could only donate a total of $48,600. So that's a maxed out contribution to what? 8-9 campaigns? I'm 8 or 9. It's somewhere in there. I'm not going to do the exact math. So that's a maxed out contribution to somewhere south of a dozen candidates. If you wanted to give to the party committees, you could do that. But you had a total aggregate limit of $75,000. You had a limit for giving to PACs of $5,000 per PAC, but also $75,000 total. And so accordingly, you couldn't really fund a modern super PAC off of $75,000 donations. And then 2014's McCutcheon versus FEC came in. Under McCutcheon, the individual limits stayed in place, but the aggregate limits were ruled to be unconstitutional. They said if you want to donate to every single House and Senate campaign in the entire country, that is your freedom to do so. That is your First Amendment right. So In 2018, you could give $5,400 per candidate. But you could give that to every single candidate for House, every single candidate for Senate, and every single one of their opponents for the entire election. So you could contribute directly to campaigns. Good morning. You could contribute directly to campaigns $2.5 million. Whereas in 2010, you could only contribute about $50,000. The aggregate limits for party committees went away. So if you contributed the maximum to every state Democratic and Republican committee, every county committee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the way down, you could donate $1.2 million to party committees. And, of course, the ending of aggregate limit on PACs allows for the funding of modern super PAC. You can contribute $5,000 per PAC, but it only costs like $300 worth of paperwork to set up a PAC. So $5,000 to this PAC, but I'm going to take $300 out to finance it, and then I'll set up another PAC, give it $5,000, we'll pay $300 for the incorporation, and so we have Allie's PAC 1, we have Allie's PAC 2, we have Allie's PAC 3, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So one donor can contribute millions, billions, legally, right? So we went from a situation where we had no super PACs at all whatsoever to one in which we have 2,300 of them. Let's see, other ways in which major donors have influence on our elections. Well, the old way that you would kind of engage in that sort of palm greasing, backslapping was called bundling. Bundling is where it's a form of fundraising in which an individual persuades others to donate large amounts that they then deliver all together to a campaign. So, hey, I and all my wealthy rich friends had this fundraiser for Hillary Clinton, and we all got together, and I'm going to go bring all of our contributions to her together. So I'm going to have like a check for every person and their spouse for the maximum $5,400, right? Times, 20 of my rich friends is, some serious money, right? We're talking 5,000 times 2 is 100. We're talking $10,000. We're talking $100,000 for 20, right? We're talking $100,000, and so a bundler could go in there and be like, boom. Here is a contribution from me and my wife and my Aunt Tilda and my cousin Zoe and my dog and my parakeet, and here's 10 grand, right? Here's 50 grand. Here's 100 grand. That used to be big money. Nowadays, with super PACs, with candidates like Mike Bloomberg spending literal hundreds of millions of dollars on their campaigns, bundling has become not necessarily as impressive. It's not so impressive that you can get, $100,000 in individual contributions. What's more impressive is that you can bring, a $600,000, $1 million, a $2 million, or a $5 million super PAC on board. Finally, we have 527 groups. 527 groups are groups that are allowed to raise and spend unlimited amounts of money for issue advocacy, but aren't allowed to coordinate with a candidate or a campaign. So these are slightly different than 501c3s. 501c3s, nonprofits, are not allowed to do any sort of political advocacy. 527s are often the political wing of nonprofits. 527s are allowed to raise and spend money for politics, but they're not allowed to advocate for a particular candidate. So the way this often works is that, so imagine I'm, Sierra Club Action, which is a 527 group on behalf of the Sierra Club. I'm going to say something like, when you go to the polls on November 2nd, Nevada, I hope that you consider who will be a good steward of our environment and our wildlands, who is prepared to lead our state into the future and deal with the severity of the climate crisis as it exists. I might even be able to say something like, Dean Heller has a history of cooperating with Nevada mining interests who have conspired to strip mine large sections of our state's wildlands. When you go to the polls, Nevada, we hope you'll consider the environment in your voting decision. But I can't say vote for Bernie Sanders, vote against Donald Trump. I can't say that. That's crossing the line. I can say, Bernie Sanders has been a champion of the environment for years, and we think you should really consider the environment when you're voting. But I can't say vote for Bernie Sanders, right? That's often many of these lines in campaign finance are very fine. Anyway, so that is our conversation on election funding. The TLDR is that our elections are overwhelmingly inundated with money. Just massive, massive, massive amounts of money being poured into our elections. And it means that individual donors are often unheard. Now, interesting trend is that we have also seen the cachet that politicians get, the political capital that they get from raising money from a bunch of small dollar donations, right? Bernie Sanders kind of pioneers this approach in 2016, although you do see shades of it in the 08 and 12 Obama campaigns, more 08 than 12. But Bernie Sanders' average donation is $27, right? I have definitely sent Bernie Sanders $3 before because I am very broke. I am trying not to touch my face. I'm really bad at it. I am really, really bad at it. But even Donald Trump's campaign was touting how many individual donors and how many small dollar donations that he was actually able to take in. Sorry. So that is kind of a path forward. We have, on the one hand, bazillions of dollars in the hands of your Jeff Bezoses and your Waltons and your Koch brother. There's only one of them left. But on the other hand, we have, kind of people-powered movements with small dollar individual contributions that really can power a campaign when people are really behind it. So that is campaign finance. Give me just a moment and we will move on to presidential campaigns. No, go away. Presidential campaigns. Who runs for president? Well, by and large, and it is strange saying this in 2020, but by and large, it is experienced politicians who run for the presidency. Nominees, the people who tend to get the nominations tend to be senators, vice presidents, and governors. There's almost always at least a couple members of the House in the primaries. Most recently, John Delaney and Tulsi Gabbard are both House members. They both tried running for election. Pretty rare to see some random mayor like Mayo Pete in the mix, but he was there. But oftentimes, the backgrounds that you see that are well represented up there are exactly what you saw. You saw Senator Kamala Harris, right? Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders. You saw former Vice President Joe Biden. And you did see some governors, right? Steve Bullock and Jay Inslee. They didn't get a lot of traction this time around. There weren't too many, gubernatorial candidates really duking it out. Interestingly enough, we saw several mayors this time around. We saw, obviously, Mayor Pete, but also Mike Bloomberg, right? Who both tried to make a go of it. But typically, like I said, senators, vice presidents, governors tend to be the people who make it through the nomination process. So if I'm just thinking about in my lifetime, we had, the former governor of California, Ronald Reagan. We had his vice president, George H.W. Bush, right? And I was a little too young to remember who was running in those elections. In 92, we had an Arkansas governor, Bill Clinton, running against, that was Dole, right? Clinton Dole, right? Running against a senator, Bob Dole, and against a businessman, Ross Perot. So this does happen. This has happened before that business people have run. In 2000, we had former Texas Governor George W. Bush running against a former Vice President, Al Gore. It's also a senator from Tennessee. You had, in 2004, Senator John Kerry running against the incumbent president. In 2008, you had a very junior Illinois Senator, Barack Obama, running against very senior Arizona Senator John McCain. In 2012, you saw former Governor Mitt Romney challenging then incumbent President Obama. And in 2016, things got weird. In 2016, you saw the Democrats nominate a former senator and former First Lady, Hillary Clinton, was also former Secretary of State, had very much the resume of the typical candidate who runs for president. And the Republicans nominated the first person in history to win the presidency without any previous political experience. And now we are maybe seeing why that is a bad thing in the midst of the United States absolutely bungling its response to the coronavirus. I didn't realize this, but apparently the virus first appeared in South Korea and the US at about the same time. And in South Korea, it's already over. Not so much here. We may be in here for months. So that's fun. And, that maybe highlights the danger of nominating the first person with no previous political experience, the first person with, no prior experience in public office, no prior executive experience, nothing like that, and electing that person president. So, three phases of presidential nomination. There are three phases of the presidential election process. First, you must win the nomination. This is the phase that we are in the middle of, or kind of towards the end of. Did Reagan have experience? Yes, Reagan was formerly governor of California. So yes, Reagan was, like I said, very much in that vein of people who run for office. Yes, he was an actor, but then he got into politics, but he did not go straight to the presidency. He ran for governor of California first, and was, by all accounts, a very popular one. Good question. So 3 phases of presidential elections, right? We have the primary, the nomination phase. This starts with what we call, in political science, what we call the invisible primary. The invisible primary, or the money primary, is that bit that happens before anybody actually votes, right? People start building an organization, they start competing for debates, they start, saying, hey, news media, look at me, because they're trying to garner media attention and make people think of them as a viable candidate for public office. Right? This is the phase of nomination where we get the Iowa straw poll and all of that fun stuff. We had, I think, 4 or 5 debates this time around before anyone even voted. And then the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. So, first off, there is no good reason for Iowa and New Hampshire to be the first primary contest in the nation. They just like it that way. Iowa and New Hampshire get outsized levels of influence in our political process because during this whole invisible primary time, when everybody's competing for money and media attention, they're also competing for votes in Iowa and in New Hampshire. I had a colleague in grad school who was from Iowa, and she talked about how political candidates were so thick on the ground there that it was irritating. Right? She was like, "Oh yeah, no, I've met Barack Obama, I've met Joe Biden, I've met Hillary Clinton, I've met all these people because, I'd just be out having breakfast at a local diner and in they would walk." That's just how Iowa politics is done. It's very retail, it's very individualistic. And then the reason that we focus so hard on Iowa is because the Iowa caucuses are the first contest in the nation. And the reason the Iowa caucuses are the first contest in the nation, and I am not making this up, I wish I was, is because Iowa State has a law on the books that says that if any other state in the nation moves their primary in advance of the Iowa caucuses, the Iowa caucuses are automatically rescheduled 2 weeks prior to that. And there was actually an attempt by several states to try and get ahead of Iowa, get ahead of New Hampshire, which has a similar law in the books. And, the primary process used to start in like March. And now it starts in late January. And basically, the 50 states of the union agreed that, okay, Iowa is serious about this, and we do not want the primary contest to start the year before the general election. So they basically gave up and let Iowa have it. And like I said, I wish I was making this up, but some of these things are facts, right? So caucuses and primaries are different things, as I think we all noticed, back in March. A primary is just like a regular election, except that all of the candidates are from the same party, right? So for a primary, you go in, you punch the ballot, or you touch the touch screen, and you look at the little receipt, and it's just like voting in a general election. Caucuses are a different thing, right? A caucus is a local meeting of voters to select candidates to represent a political party in a general election, to choose delegates for a convention who then select the candidate. It's very complicated. But if you actually went out and got to caucus out here in Nevada, because we were a caucus state, at least this time around, I'll talk more about that when we get to the Nevada chapter, you'll note that it was more complicated than just punching a button. If you went and early voted for the caucus, you got to rank your choices. And that's to simulate the actual logic of the caucus, where people get to, they have people line up in a room, and okay, well, here's for this candidate, here's for this candidate, here's for this candidate. And then whichever candidates have the least votes, they eliminate those candidates, and allow those people to reallocate themselves among those lines. So it is an involved process, and involves talking with your neighbors about politics, and involves taking a few hours on a Saturday to go and get involved. So caucuses, a lot of people hate caucuses. Why is that? Because it takes a lot more time than a regular election. It takes many hours. Some of these Nevada caucus meetings, doors open at 10, caucus starts at 12. Some of the caucuses weren't done until 3 or 4. And so if you got there at 10 and left at 4, that is a 6-hour day on a Saturday. And I don't know about y'all, but I got better things to do on a Saturday morning than go stand in a high school gym and argue about politics with my neighbors for 6 hours. With a regular election, you go in, boom, 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 you go out. With a primary, it's a process. With a caucus, it's a process. So it was actually really cool to see the Nevada caucus early voting process this time around, which simulates that realignment procedure without having to actually stand there, in a high school gym and argue about politics with your neighbors. They'll let you pick first candidate, second candidate, third candidate. And so because of that, we all had the same freedom to, realign our votes if our candidate didn't end up getting enough. But we didn't have to go down and spend the hours at a high school gym. Now, the waiting lines were long. I waited 2 hours myself. But, the actual casting of the ballot was a lot quicker. So there's also distinctions among primary elections. Primary elections, as I said, much easier. You just get a ballot, and all the candidates are from the same party, but otherwise they're basically the same thing. But some states have closed primaries, and some states have open primaries. Nevada is a closed primary state. If you want to vote in the Democratic primary, you must be registered as a Democrat. If you want to vote in the Republican primary, you must be registered as a Republican. Some states, that's not the case. Some states, if you're a Republican and it's a year like 2020 where the Republican primary doesn't really have anybody in it because they're nominating Trump, right? Well, you might want to go vote in the Democratic primary and pick who you want Donald Trump to run against, right? California actually has a hybrid system where the Republican primary is closed. So you have to be registered Republican to vote in the Republican primary. But the Democratic primary, you can vote if you're Democrat or if you're independent. So it's this weird thing. So it's kind of a semi-open, quasi-open primary. So that we have the Iowa primary, or Iowa caucus, New Hampshire primary, first two contests in the primary election. After that, it is South Carolina, and then it is Nevada. So we're fourth. And then there's Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday recently happened. I think it was the third week of February. Super Tuesday is a date on the primary calendar when something like a couple dozen states all hold their primaries and caucuses on that same day. And then we move on to the phase of the primary process that we're in now, which is states have these state-by-state contests. And slowly but steadily we creep towards a situation where by June or July, all 50 states will have voted for their nominee. Now, both the Democratic and Republican primaries now allocate delegates based on a proportional system of allocation. So it used to be everything was winner take all, much like it is in the general election. If you win a state, you win all of that state's primary delegates, right? Same like if in 48 of 50 states, if you win the statewide vote for president, you get all of that state's electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska are the two exceptions to that. They actually allocate some of their congressional votes some of their electoral votes by congressional district. Fun fact. But in the primary, used to be winner take all. Some later contests on the Republican side are still winner take all, but all of the early contests for both parties and all of the contests for the Democratic Party are allocated based on a proportional system, so if you get 35% of the votes in Michigan, you get 35% of Michigan's delegates. If you get 52% of the votes, you get 52% of the delegates. So accordingly, that can make the primary contest significantly longer and allow candidates who are losing to stay in the race a lot longer than a winner-take-all system where a candidate that has 50% plus one is going to get a big boost to their standing. So right now, like I said, we're in this kind of the later stage here where we have these post-Super Tuesday state-by-state contests in the primary election. And I hate to admit it, but it does look like Joe Biden is probably going to win this one. Although if people start voting dramatically different and because of, I don't know, random public health crisis, maybe people will start voting for Medicare for all. We can all cross our fingers, but so far it hasn't turned out that way. Next, we move to the convention. The convention is basically a big party that presents the candidate to the public. Excuse me. They rent out a big convention center somewhere, and all the delegates who are actual people, like when they say you've won delegates, there are actually people attached to that who get to go to the convention and cast their vote in favor of their candidate. And so people will go to this convention center and they have this round of balloting and all the delegates vote, and most of the time it is a foregone conclusion. We haven't had a contested convention since 1968, which means that in every convention in my lifetime, and the overwhelming majority of them in my mother's lifetime, we have known who the nominee is going to be before the convention. So the convention acts as basically, again, this big party, this formal presentation of the candidate to the public, and an occasion for a lot of people to make a lot of very impassioned speeches. Actually, Barack Obama was kind of raised to notoriety when he, as an Illinois state senator, gave an impassioned speech at the Democratic National Convention in 2004 that, a lot of people say basically paved the way for his Senate campaign. Oops. The convention, if done well, causes a spike in the polls. It causes an electoral bounce, a convention bounce, about 3 to 5% for that candidate. But both parties have a convention, so it typically cancels out after they're both over. If a convention is done poorly, it can end up hurting that candidate dramatically. In 1968, the Democratic Convention was basically torn apart by conflict over civil rights. And there was a major faction in the Democratic Party that wanted to nominate a segregationist, Alabama Governor George Wallace, and there were a whole bunch of Northern Democrats, many of them people of color, who wanted to nominate a very pro-racial justice, relative radical, by the name of George McGovern. And McGovern eventually prevailed out of the convention, but not until after 15 rounds of balloting and literal riots in the streets of Chicago around the convention. The reason he prevailed is because the Southern Democrats eventually said, okay, we're taking our candidate and going home. And they ran a third Dixiecrat candidacy, George Wallace's candidacy, alongside that of George McGovern. It was the biggest electoral landslide for a Republican since Lincoln. Actually, I think Lincoln didn't even win that. I think it was the biggest. It was McGovern lost everything but his home state. It was a blowout for, of all people, Richard Nixon, who trounced the Democrats in that election. So a convention done well gives you a moderate bounce that mostly gets canceled out a little bit later when the other party does their convention. Convention done poorly can destroy your candidacy. And so it remains to be seen what happens if, I guess we're probably not in that place anymore, but there was speculation for a while that the Democratic Convention might end up being contested this year. And that would end up being even more disastrous because this year they changed the rules. Okay, so has anyone heard of these super delegates? And maybe you're not sure what these are and confused about them. So after the 1968 convention, basically as a way of trying to prevent that from ever happening again, the Democratic Party gave party officials and elected officials across the country automatic votes, automatic seats at the convention, so that essentially they would be able to shove the party towards whatever candidate the party establishment supported. Obviously, that was a bad look in 2016 when the party establishment was firmly behind Hillary Clinton, while many voters were quite equally firmly behind Bernie Sanders. And so when superdelegates came into the equation, a lot of people cried conspiracy. Whether true or not, those charges led to reform in the Democratic convention process to the point that superdelegates no longer vote on the first ballot. However the people voted is how the people voted. And if there's no one candidate who gets a majority there, then the superdelegates get to have their say, and they're overwhelmingly in favor of Biden. Surprise, surprise. So, accordingly, we're probably not going to get to a situation where that comes into play because every other candidate who dropped out right before Super Tuesday dropped out in time to make sure that that Biden probably can secure a majority of the delegates. So superdelegates probably not going to be a factor this time around. Okay, so conventions happen in like late July, early August-ish. It's a late summer kind of thing. And it used to be that people would have, they would do these primaries throughout the winter and spring, have this convention in late summer, and then people would kind of chill until the first week of September. Which is, I believe, Labor Day, right? So people would just, so the candidates would just kind of sit on their heels from August, for a few weeks until Labor Day, and then they get back to it. Sorry. That was my mother. And I get text message alerts on my desktop, so I apologize for that. Let me just go ahead and quit this so that doesn't happen again. Anyway, nowadays we don't have that pause between the convention and on Labor Day. Candidates don't cool their heels. As soon as the conventions are over, sometimes even before the conventions are over, candidates pivot towards the general election. They start attacking their opposite party opponents. They start moving towards, hashing out the November general election as soon as they possibly can. That November general election, that process is going to take, 3 months? You're going to typically see 2 or 3 debates between the candidates and at least one vice presidential debate. Which, by the way, vice presidential nominations are typically selected just before the convention and unveiled at the convention, right? So by July or August, you'll know who the vice president pick is going to be. But so typically the debate format lately has been one domestic policy, one foreign policy, one town hall. And then, like it says, one vice presidential debate as well. So that's how we end up running elections. How do we win those elections? Well, the bad news is that a lot of electoral politics is not about things that presidents themselves can control. The economic outlook is considered the most important factor in winning a presidential election. And so, when the economy does well, the incumbent party tends to do well in that election. When the economy does poorly, the incumbent party tends to be blamed for it. And so, it was looking like the president had a relatively smooth path to re-election, sadly enough. Of course, we're now seeing estimates that this whole pandemic may cause an annualized economic decline of 30% in our nation's economic output. To put that in perspective, typically growth is between 1 and 2%. So, it would take us 15 years to climb out of the hole that's going to be cratered into our economy in the next few months. Hold on to your hats, folks. This is going to get ugly. But accordingly, it wouldn't surprise me if Trump has a harder time getting reelected with the economy in the middle of free fall and with him being largely seen. Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to it. But him being largely seen as incompetent and bailing out large corporations at the expense of, actual people. So, things besides economic policy. Obviously, demographics are a big one. We talked in chapters 7 and 8 about how our experiences and our demographic characteristics shape our political opinions. And so, with changes in national demographics, we see changes in voting patterns, right? Texas and Georgia are both kind of on the verge of becoming swing states, largely due to significant increases in the Latino population in each one, because Latinos these days are coalescing around the Democratic candidate, and they're growing as a share of the American public. So if you see more and more Latinos, then you see more and more Democratic voters, then you start seeing things shift. We're also seeing places like Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan becoming increasingly white, and a lot of people fleeing those places, and those places becoming increasingly Republican, right? So demographics do determine a lot of the playing field on which our elections are played. War and foreign policy end up being important. Many elections have turned around questions of war and terrorism and what you're going to do about the scary foreigners out there trying to get us. Sorry, that's a really common theme for a campaign. And Republican candidates particularly tend to do relatively well during foreign policy elections. We'll talk about issue ownership when we get to the party section, but Republicans tend to do better on issues of war and peace than Democrats. Domestic politics tends to matter less, and that's partially because, as we talked about in the media chapter, the media often doesn't cover the issues of the campaign very well, right? We end up talking about the horse race, we end up talking about who's ahead, who's behind. We don't end up really talking about who wants to do what with our country, right? Domestic issues don't end up swaying a lot of people's vote. They really don't. But they do tend to be a reliable guide for how that presidency is going to proceed. As I mentioned, one tiny bit of good news out of this class is that presidents do try and keep their campaign promises. Something like 65 to 70% of campaign promises see some sort of formal action during the course of a presidency. Other major things that you need to win a presidential election, at least previously we thought a campaign organization was pretty damn important. Candidates need to be able to make those mobilizing phone calls. They need to be able to send those people out to go knock on your door and say, hey, I'm here from the Bernie Sanders campaign. Are you going to vote in the caucus? They need to have people organized in these states to buy ad time in the right times in the right places, to get out to community events, to go talk to voters and get stuff going on. But we've also seen the internet over the years substituting for a lot of that campaign organization. And so a lot of what used to be coordinated out of campaign offices can now be coordinated centrally through a website or something. And we've seen that online organizing can in some ways supplant offline organizing, can sometimes replace it. So in the 2016 presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton had a strong organization. She had campaign offices all over the country. She was doing what presidential candidates do, which is build a strong ground game, right? But in 2016, the Trump campaign did not, and yet they won anyway, right? The Trump campaign really ignored a lot of the traditional trappings of a presidential campaign and managed to win the presidency anyway. Part of that is because parties do matter, right? Party organizations can step in and provide a lot of the things that campaign organizations do. Party loyalties matter, and in an increasingly polarized country, it is becoming harder and harder to imagine swing voters switching between one party to another. And so, it doesn't necessarily matter that, you have a Republican operative come to your door and tell you to vote. The TV machine has been telling you, hey, the Democrats are going to destroy the country that you know and love, and has been saying that every day forever. So maybe you're mobilized already, right? Okay, those were keys. So anyway, I thought I heard glass breaking. So anyway, we also have the presidential election. Presidential election is not played on a national board. It is played on it is not one election. It is 50 elections, 50 state-by-state contests, weighted by this arcane system that we call the Electoral College, right? You can see over here, this is the Electoral College map. Weighted, each state is proportional to the size of its Electoral College votes. So you can see that California is looking a little chubby over here. That's because California has 55 Electoral College votes. Nevada is somewhat slimmer, right? You can see that New Jersey is also a heckin' chonker. And that Vermont and New Hampshire, not so much. You can see that a lot of these big square states in the middle don't have any people in them, right? And it should be mentioned that this map understates the population divisions in these states. Because all these states that have 3 electoral votes don't have the population to support 3 electoral votes. They should be even smaller, right? So, swing states. As I said, we don't have one presidential election. We have 50 presidential elections, one in each state. And in most of those presidential elections, we know how the outcome is going to be well before any votes are cast. California is going to vote for the Democrat. New York is going to vote for the Democrat. Texas is going to vote for the Republican, right? Oklahoma is going to vote for the Republican. So in many of these states, we know the outcome before a ballot is even cast. The states where that is not true, we call swing states, right? States where the election could go either way. States like Ohio and Pennsylvania, where partisan balance is around 50-50. And that changes in mobilization could really affect things. States like Florida, and states like, yes, our own dear Silver State here in Nevada. Although, for the record, I think that demographics are shifting Nevada further into the blue column with every passing election. Nevada in 16 did go for Hillary. Nevada in 18 did elect a Democratic governor, and 5 out of 6 statewide offices as Democrats, as well as a Democratic Senate, a Democratic Assembly, 3 out of 4 Democratic House members, and yet another Democratic senator to join the one that we already had there. So I don't think Nevada is going to be a swing state much longer. But who knows? partially I think that's because of the brand of conservatism that is reigning in the Republican Party right now, which is not the brand of conservatism that you more familiarly find out west. You know, Western conservatives tend to be a lot more get off my land and leave me alone, and Southern conservatives tend to be a lot more being gay makes the baby Jesus cry. So you kind of different things going on here. Thing is, you can have all of these things and you can still lose. And as we saw in 2016, you can be missing many of them and still win. The recipe for winning a presidential election is elusive. And I'm sorry, there's just a broken piece in my desk that I've got to fix here before it drives me crazy. There we go. Anyway, so yeah, it's hard to know what's going to win a presidential election and what won't. It's especially hard to know what's going to win a presidential election in the midst of this unprecedented economic and viral crisis that we are going through. It remains to be seen how this will affect our politics. Although, buckle in, it's going to be a wild ride. So, predicting presidential elections. So, it's not hard to find presidential election prediction models. Here is 538's general election prediction model, or general election polling model. So they don't even have their prediction. Here's a prediction model for the primary election, and you can see how disappointing it is. Super Tuesday, and Joe Biden basically won the whole thing. Bernie was ahead there. There was like a month there where it seemed possible that Bernie Sanders is going to be our next president, but anyway. So you can see actually these lines are the upcoming primary elections. These are prediction models, right? This isn't a presidential one. I wish they would have the presidential one up. They don't have it up yet. Oh shoot, that's the wrong kind of prediction model. Okay, so there's two kinds of prediction models, right? First off, there are models like the ones I showed you, like 538, like Real Clear Politics. These are polling models. They look at public opinion polling. They look at public opinion polling, and they try to predict the results of the presidential election state by state and in the Electoral College based on that. Not always accurate, but an honest attempt to try and figure out what's going on. On the other hand, though, we have prediction models that are produced by political scientists that try to predict the presidential election based on non-polling factors, based on factors like the economy or war deaths or presidential job approval, things like that. And there is a political scientist who has a model called the Bread and Peace model, and he can predict presidential elections with something like 85% accuracy based on only two factors. One, the unemployment rate in the country as an indicator of the economy, and two, the number of war deaths in the year prior to the election, number of U.S. war dead. And using that, he can predict with 85% accuracy the presidential election, right? So a couple of key factors can be absolutely critical to the to winning a presidential election, right? As I said earlier in the lecture, those aren't always under a president's control, or especially not under a presidential candidate's control. If the economy is doing well, the incumbent party will tend to do better. If the economy is doing poorly, the incumbent party will tend to do worse. If the country is embroiled in a long and bloody war, then the country will tend to vote for the challenger. If the country is at peace, they will tend to vote for the incumbent. If the president has high job approval ratings, they will tend to be more likely to be reelected. So we can predict presidential elections based on these factors without necessarily looking at polling on presidential elections. Another phenomenon is what we call the thermostatic model of public opinion, which is that voters seem to just get fatigued with the party in power. It's very, very rare for a presidential candidate to serve 2 terms and then be succeeded by a president of their own party. It's just very rare. After 8 years of one party in government, it seems like Americans like a change. 8 years of moving to the left, you get a vote to the right. 8 years of moving to the right, you get a vote to the left. Right? It should also be noted that prediction models often have trouble dealing with the difficulty of the Electoral College, and this goes in both cases, right? Often the output of these scientific prediction models is a national popular vote total. And as we saw in 2016, we do not have a national election for president. We have 50 state-by-state contests, and the Electoral College sometimes causes problems with that. This is particularly exacerbated by the demographics of the 2 parties' coalitions as they exist right now. We'll talk in a little more detail about this in Chapter 12, but we have a situation where the Republican Party is particularly popular with white, evangelical Christian, rural voters. Exactly the sort of voters that tend to populate big, empty rural states, but also, by the way, populate the rural areas of many, many states. If within any geographic area, like you can look at the island of Manhattan, and you will find that the Republicans live in Midtown, and the Democrats live in Uptown and Downtown, which are denser. So Republicans tend towards sparse living, tend towards rural areas, and our Electoral College advantages rural areas. This maybe made sense in the 1780s when we were all subsistence farmers, but nowadays it simply means that states like Wyoming and Idaho and Montana, the Dakotas, all get way more electoral power than they really should have. Also means they get a lot more power in the U.S. Senate than they really should. Something like the smallest 25 states, so that's 50 senators, right? The smallest 25 states represent something like 17% of the population. Even today, a Republican majority represents like 40% of the population to the Democrats' 60%. Excuse me. So the consequence of that is that if you have a party that is becoming more and more and more every day the party of rural voters, and you have a system that gives rural voters an outsized influence on our politics, well, then you have a system that is pretty much guaranteed to advance those voters' interests over the interests of a majority of the country. And so you end up with a situation where, well, the country voted for Hillary Clinton, but because the people who voted for Hillary Clinton were concentrated in big urban states like California, like New York, like Illinois, like hell, Nevada, right? Which is where most Nevadans are urban. Most Nevadans live here in the valley. And those votes are concentrated in those big states where the voting power is diminished. Furthermore, Democrats tend to win their elections by larger margins. So, Hillary Clinton won California by like 70-odd%, Donald Trump won Wisconsin by 0.1%. But we have winner-take-all elections. Every single vote that you get above 50% and won is essentially wasted by our system. You don't get to transfer these 3 million votes that you got in California and take them to Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio, where you could really, really use, an extra 10,000 here, an extra 10,000 there. You can't do that in our system. So accordingly, even the best prediction models often have difficulty predicting our presidential elections. And also accordingly, Republicans have a significant bias in their favor in presidential elections. Political scientists estimate that a Democrat could win as much as, a Republican could win as little as 43% of the vote and still be elected president. So a Democrat could win 57% of the vote, and still there would be, I think, a 1 in 8 chance that they would lose the presidency because of our electoral college system. That's not even getting into the fact that the presidency is crippled without the consent of the Senate, which also heavily, heavily overrepresents those big empty states in the middle. Right. I'll get back to that. So do I have any questions on presidential elections before I go further? If you've got a question, just type a question mark really quick into the chat, and then I'll know that somebody has a question, and I'm not just sitting here staring at the screen for no reason. So I'm gonna wait just a second, give everybody a chance to get back to their keyboard, or just like I said, just go ahead and type a question mark. Okay, moving on then. Let's move on to congressional elections. This one is on my notes. So, first off, who runs for Congress? Well, there are 2 formal requirements for running for Congress. You do have to be 25 years of age to run for the House. You do have to be 30 years of age to run for the Senate. So, when I first taught this class, I was not old enough to run for Senate. You can be an immigrant, but you have to have been a U.S. citizen for quite some time. Had to have 7 years citizenship for the House, 9 years citizenship in the Senate. You have to live. There's 3 requirements. The third requirement is that you have to live in the state that you represent. You don't have to live in the district you represent. So, Mark Amodei is the congressman for Reno, and I'm pretty sure he lives in Reno, but he doesn't have to. If someday he wanted to move to Las Vegas, he could do that and still represent Reno. Similarly, if Dina Titus wanted to live in, Incline Village, which is a very lovely town on the shores of Lake Tahoe, and inhabited by so many rich people that it's also nicknamed Income Village. But if she wanted to live there, and represent Las Vegas, she could do that. Indeed, there is a member of the House, Mary Bono-Mack, who represents Palm Springs. She doesn't live in Palm Springs. She lives in Hollywood, but she's represented Palm Springs for many, many years. You're allowed to do that. You have to live in the state. Don't have to live in your district. So those are the formal requirements. I should run. Oh, I study politicians. I don't ever want to be one. There is a level of scrutiny that comes with being in public service that I honestly do not want to have in my life. But thank you so much, Kathy, for the suggestion. Anyway, so formal requirements: got to be 25, got to be 7 years a citizen for the House, got to be 30 and 9 years a citizen for the Senate. And either way, you've got to live in the state you represent. The next big requirement, as with everything in the United States, is money. The average successful House campaign costs about $1.7 million to run. Average successful Senate campaign, looking closer to 10 mil. Right? It takes a lot of money in terms of campaign contributions in order to mount a successful campaign. So you might think that it's all wealthy businessmen and celebrities who run for these offices. You might think that, but you'd be wrong. You see relatively few major business leaders or celebrities running for office. The current, orange-faced buffoon in the White House notwithstanding. You saw Meg Whitman and Carly Fiorina both running in California for high office, one for governor, one for Senate, and I don't remember which is which, to be honest. And they were both, very wealthy tech executives, and they both got absolutely trounced in their respective elections. It does happen from time to time, like Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger of California, whose signature is actually on my diploma. Governor's the Board of Regents. I went to a UC, so Arnold Schwarzenegger's signature is on my BA. So it does happen. Governor Jesse the Body Ventura of Minnesota, who was very popular as a governor for quite some time. It does happen, but also sometimes it doesn't. Jerry Springer ran in Ohio and lost. Linda McMahon of WWE, she ran, she lost. It's pretty rare to see celebrities actually win, and most of the time it's not, like I said, it's not the super rich who are running for Congress. They seem to be content to buy Congress. The ones who run typically, though, they tend to be that kind of, lower upper class, if you will, that professional strata. You got the most common profession in Congress is lawyer. You've got like 75% of members of Congress who were attorneys prior to serving in office. Next most common one is doctor. You got a lot of medical doctors in Congress. Rand Paul is somehow an OBGYN. I wouldn't make an appointment at his office, but okay. Former Nevada Senator John Ensign, who resigned in disgrace after a scandal involving him sleeping with one of his staffers and paying her husband to keep quiet about it. He's a veterinarian, actually still is to this day. He has a clinic down on Charleston and Rampart, the Boca Park Animal Hospital. That is disgraced former senator and veterinary doctor John Ensign's veterinary clinic. So you get a lot of those like high wealth professional classes, lawyers, doctors, things like that. You don't see a lot of professors because, quite frankly, we're not that rich. You don't see a lot of professors, you don't see a lot of educators, you don't see a lot of scientists because none of us have any money. And obviously you really don't see a lot of laborers or things like that. We do have one bartender in Congress, woo! Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who ran for a seat in Brooklyn. She was a bartender immediately prior to running for Congress. That is really, really rare, but sometimes it does happen. And I freaking love AOC. She is amazing, and you all should check her out because I love her so much. But so anyway, money alone doesn't make the difference, but not having money definitely does. Right? So if you don't have the cash on hand, you're gonna get buried. If you have the cash on hand, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win. But if you don't have the cash on hand, you are going to lose. Right? Money rarely swings congressional elections, but money is kind of your ticket to the table. Okay. Easiest way to get into Congress? Be married to a member of Congress, especially if they die. It is not uncommon for wives of deceased members of Congress to take over their husband's seat in Congress. In fact, that Palm Springs Congresswoman I mentioned, Mary Bono Mack, the Bono in Mary Bono Mack is actually Sonny Bono, right? Formerly of Sonny and Cher. Obviously, they broke up, and he married. This is Sonny Bono's second wife, and Sonny Bono was the congressman for Palm Springs for a while. Who knew? Till Sonny Bono was killed in a skiing accident, and the governor of California appointed his wife, Mary Bono Mack, to fill his seat in Congress, and she's just been there ever since. So having family in Congress, that definitely helps. Obviously, we don't like to say that we do, but we definitely have political dynasties in America. George W. Bush's George W. Bush's grandfather was a senator. His dad was a governor. He was a governor. His kid's probably going to run for something. It's not. The name Bush goes a long way in American politics. The name Kennedy goes a really long way in American politics. We had a Kennedy of the Massachusetts Kennedys in office in Congress for the entire 20th century and most of the 21st. Ted Kennedy did pass away in 2010, and so we didn't have a Kennedy in office for a few years there until Joe Kennedy III from Massachusetts stepped in to rectify our nation's tragic Kennedy deficit. So we definitely have political dynasties in this country. Certain names have certain cachet. The name Clinton carries some weight. The name Bush does. The name Kennedy does. All those things. You'll hear locally the name Laxalt carries some weight. The name Tarkanian carries some weight, right? So other things that'll help you run for Congress, if you've previously been in the state government. Close to half of the challengers who won for the Senate were political veterans. If you've previously been in the state house, if you've been in city council, something like that, typically you're going to have an easier time of it. You can kind of start your political career in the House. You really can't start your political career in the Senate. You gotta go from somewhere to end up in the Senate. You have to have some sort of political experience. And of course, the best way to get elected to Congress is to have previously been elected to Congress. Here are the rates at which we re-elect our members of Congress. Senate's on top, House is on the bottom. And you can see that, with a few exceptions, the overwhelming majority, usually above 90% of incumbents, are re-elected to Congress. The tendency for members of Congress to win re-election is, in overwhelming numbers, is what we call incumbency advantage. Now, this is all despite the fact that Congress right now has a 9% approval rating. The microphone did not cut out. I said 9, as in the number between 8 and 10. The following things have higher approval ratings than Congress: Richard Nixon during Watergate, BP during the big oil spill, the United States going communist, a literal alien invasion, root canals. Those are all more popular than Congress. Yet somehow we send 90% of them back every year, or every other year. Right? Why is this? Well, members of Congress have gotten very skilled at running against Congress, right? Your member of Congress says to you, I've done all sorts of good things to this district. I'm going to Washington, and I'm going out there to fight for you and to drain the swamp, right? To change how things are done in Washington. Now, set aside the fact that this person has been in Washington for 30 years and hasn't changed how things are done yet, but typically people despise Congress but tend to defend their own personal congressional representatives. Right? So members who get reelected get really good at fighting against the institution to which they were elected. So let's see. I'm actually going to go ahead and call our lecture here. I'm going to finish talking about congressional elections. We're going to talk about gerrymandering. We're going to talk about reform to American elections when we come back on Thursday morning at 8 a.m. Just a quick update on course housekeeping things in case you weren't here when I went over them in the first place. I have set dates for the exams. Exam number 2 is basically going to be given over spring break. It'll be available on the Friday after, not this week's lecture, but next week's Thursday lecture. That Friday the exam will be available. It will be taken on Canvas, just like the practice quizzes. Then the final exam will be made available Wednesday of finals week through Sunday of finals week. It will be due at 11:59 p.m. Sunday of finals week. Paper is still due on the same date, still submitted via Canvas. And if you are like some of my other eager beavers out there and you've already finished your paper, first off, I will say that if you wrote on the parties prompt, and you should not turn your paper in yet. If you wrote on the presidential prompt, you should also not turn your paper in yet. Wait until we cover chapters 11 and 14 respectively, and then turn your paper in. But second, I have opened the boxes. You can go ahead and upload your paper if you want, but you only get one upload. So make sure that it is the quality that you would like to submit before you submit it. Anything else? That is all I have. Please continue to shoot me messages if you have any questions. And other than that, I will see you all here at 8 in the morning on Thursday, where we will continue our discussion of congressional elections, and we might start parties. We'll see. I will talk to you all Thursday at 8. Until then, stay safe, everybody, and don't go too stir crazy out there. See you then. Bye-bye.